So Trump has named some of his appointments to the Trump presidency going forward, including Reince Priebus as his chief of staff and Breitbart's Steve Bannon, who was also the CEO of his campaign, as chief strategist and counsel, whatever that means. Pence will lead the transition team, which we already know. He, of course, elbowed out Chris Christie.
Not an easy thing to do.
Not an easy thing to do. Chris Christie got a lot of flack because of Bridgegate. Also, he wanted to transition the Supreme Court into the Supreme Food Court. That's a joke. Anyway, so...
Wait, he really wanted to do that?
That's what he wanted to do.
Yeah. It's the Supreme Food Court?
Yeah, someone said Taco Supreme Court. How about Taco Supreme Court? Anyhow.
There's no such thing.
According to Paul Ryan, there will be no deportation force. We're not planning on erecting an immigration force.
You're kidding. It's almost like Trump was playing the people to vote for him. It's almost like Trump was completely bullshitting, which goes against everything he's ever done. I can't believe that he was playing those people. That's weird. He's not going to build a wall? That is so weird.
Yeah, said he's not going to build necessarily a wall all the way through, but there will be some kind of fencing in places where there needs not be a wall.
Has he announced when he's going to renegotiate NAFTA?
No one knows. But there are people who are, the ones who are defending his appointments are, funny enough, Reince Priebus, especially the attacks on Bannon, on Stephen Bannon, who is a former Breitbart. Basically, a lot of people are saying he's responsible for the alt-right, and it's hard to disagree with them.
Hard to disagree.
And here is Priebus appearing to defend Bannon on Morning Joe.
There are some concerns about Steve Bannon because of the Breitbart connections. What would you say to those people that have those concerns right now?
Well, that's not the Steve Bannon that I know, and I've spent a lot of time with him. But look, this is all about achieving President-elect Trump's agenda. And I can assure you, and I think it's really important, and I know that President-elect Trump wants everyone to understand this, that all Americans out there, no matter your race, your gender, your ethnic background, he wants to make you proud of our country. He wants to serve you.
The appointment of Stephen Bannon, even if he did go to Harvard Business School or whatever, sends a signal that some of the stoked up hatred that happened in the fringe parts of the internet are things that he's bringing into the White House. Am I wrong about that? And how do you reassure people that's not the case?
Well, I think everyone out there can agree that you judge people as you see them, not as other people have said. And that's what I would say is that, it's what people do. It's how people act on a day-to-day basis, and that's nothing I've ever seen. I've only seen a generous, hospitable, wise person to work with. And the other thing about President-elect Trump, and everyone understands it who knows him, he listens to a lot of people. If anyone thinks that I'm the only one that's going to walk into that office and say, this is what you have to do, I think in a lot of cases he takes the advice, but he likes to listen to a lot of people, and that's a good thing.
Response?
Well, my response is that Reince Priebus a great choice to be. Honestly, though, I mean, like he's a Republican president. He's not going to name who we want to be the chief of staff of the White House. Reince Priebus somehow, through all of this, was able to keep that group together. And as chairman of a party that seemed to fall away with the candidacy of Trump, he was able to somehow keep those people together, keep people behind them, and then Trump won. So how in the world, I mean, objectively speaking, not speaking with any opinion here, how do you not say that this is the perfect pick to be the chief of staff, to bring the staff together and be the liaison between the Republican Congress and the president? I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer perfect pick. It's amazing that we're sitting here talking about it. That's all.
That is amazing.
Right.
Reince Priebus, who I'm pretty sure by the end of the campaign they had him working out of the back of a 7-Eleven.
That's
somewhere.
Right.
I mean, this guy. I mean, he once threatened. Didn't he threaten to cut off Trump funds?
At one point, he did. And at one point, he said, well, when asked, he was like, "We're not going to have to worry about that." This was early on in the campaign when people were talking about the hypothetical of a Trump presidency. Well, we're not going to have to worry about that, but we do have to respect all the opinions and all the candidates in our party. Well, there they are.
So, is there more video about Bannon?
There's more video about Bannon.
Yeah, because Bannon is a totally different conversation.
Yeah, Reince Priebus, I actually like listening to him because his speech pattern is like a guy who's super angry and drunk.
Right. Yeah. And long-suffering Brewers fan, too, probably. Right?
Yeah.
Before we go on, you said he was somehow able to keep all these people together. The sad part is, like, I know exactly how he's able to keep these people together because they want to stay with their jobs as long as possible. So eventually they rolled over.
Right. Well, of course, but it's whatever you like. I don't like being in the position of defending Reince Priebus. I can't stand
You
Reince.
love this.
But if you're looking at who should be rewarded in the world of Republicana right now, it should be Reince Priebus to a degree because the party has seemed to fall together behind. Even, I mean, you're seeing texts or tweets from Ben Sass and Lindsey Graham and Jeff Flake, all senators who were very much against Donald Trump, who are saying now, well, we got to look and let him. He won, and we got to see this. He was able to keep all these people together somehow, and he was teetering on being the worst chairman of a party ever. And now he's the chief of staff.
That's what a victory will do for you.
That's what a victory will do. That's what, listen, Karl Rove was a recount away from being a moron, right? Mm-hmm. And then he became the guru, right? The brain, or Bush's brain, all these things. It's happened before, and that's what happens in politics. It happens in sports. It happens everywhere, So.
And he just got lucky that they got to run against the Bill Buckner of politics.
Yeah, well, that's a different conversation. But I think that, I do think that...
He wasn't hiding behind the base.
I do think that there's something incredible about the fact that Reince Priebus is going to be chief of staff after this year and a half.
There's no doubt about it. Yeah. It's incredible. I mean, the whole thing almost crumbled right in front of him. He's threatening to cut off funds to the guy who ends up winning. I mean, it is amazing. And when Trump brought him up on stage on election night at the victory speech, it was almost like, watch this. Come here, say something nice about me.
Yeah.
Fucking say something nice about me right now. That's what that was. And it was beautiful to see him do that in a sense. Yeah. Like for theater, it was beautiful
for
theater.
The theater.
Yeah.
And speaking of the Bill Buckner, he was speaking, they were running against the people who were still around because they won an election, 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And they were, monolith is the people who know exactly what's going on, and they still were around during the Clinton campaign. Anyways, let's move on to more explicit talk about Steve Bannon. This is Jason Miller, the Trump communications director, appearing on CNN with Chris Cuomo to talk about Bannon.
Steve Bannon, as a hire, fights that notion that Trump will be a more benevolent Trump. He'll be a more unifying Trump. He'll be get it done, not just advance an agenda. Because Steve Bannon is not an ordinary placement in the White House. He is a promoter of the alt-right and a very controversial guy. How does that square with Trump being different than he was in the campaign?
Well, Chris, if you've seen the president-elect since the election, he's taken a very measured tone. He's made it very clear that he's going to get to work for the American people right away, and that he's moved past the election. And what I think is frustrating is when we see so much news coverage, particularly on this network, unfortunately, on the issues that divide us following the election.
But the challenge is to unite. Steve Bannon is not a statement of unity. This is a man whose wife said he didn't want his girls in a school because they had too many Jews there. Breitbart is what it is. Ted Cruz, whom you worked for, used to point to it as a poison affecting his own party. How is that a nod towards unity?
Chris, again, I think that your focus on trying to divide people, I think is...
Not fair, Jason. No, not fair.
Chris,
you
exactly
put Bannon in position, not me. I don't put out the headlines on Breitbart. He does. He is seen as the architect of a very effective strategy that Donald Trump used during the election, which you guys now say needs to be left behind. But you're bringing the architect of it with you. That's not on me.
Chris, since day one, when Steve Bannon joined Mr. Trump's operation and now heading into the White House, his job has been to help Mr. Trump implement his vision. He has done exactly that, and he's done a fantastic job.
But you are who you have around you, and the Jekyll and Hyde thing is of your own creation, not ours. I mean, Bannon reached out to Marine Le Pen. Her grandfather founded the National Front Political. He was an anti-Semite. He was quoted as saying the races are unequal. Bannon reaches out to someone like that to work with the administration. What kind of message does that send?
Chris, the clear message coming from Mr. Trump since this election is that our country has, over the past 8 years, become way too divided.
Look. We're too divided. So what I've decided is to build a few walls between everyone and then keep complaining about how we're divided. That's what I want to do. And I just want to remind people, this is a good thing in a sense. You have to keep at the sight of the goal. The goal is what? To get rid of a Trump presidency, right? The goal is to overturn these right-wing neo-fascists, proto-fascists, right? So how do you do that? You do that by having Trump surround himself with people like that. You have, by Trump, the more reprehensible the people are that Trump surrounds himself for, the better for the country in the long term. In the short term, this all feels gross, like a shitty sandwich that we still have to eat. But you have to understand that Trump's going in the most damaged president ever to take the presidency. He's the most unpopular guy to ever take the presidency. Do you think those numbers are going to go up, or do you think those numbers are going to go down? Especially with the people he's surrounding himself with people that the country has already rejected 1,000,000 times over. Chris Christie's at his lowest numbers ever. Rudy Giuliani is everyone knows is a blemish on America. So. If he tries to get Bolton was hated during the George Bush administration. So anything he does, and Bannon, this is a good thing for the country in a sense because it just marginalizes him. This is going to be a disaster of a presidency. So that's what we have to hope for in a sense. That they'll just self-destruct, right? So and Trump is proving that he's getting ready to self-destruct again by doing stuff like this. This is again he could have done something else. He could have tried to actually reach out. There's people are saying, even Barack Obama is saying, well, we have to try to, and all that stuff. He's not. So Trump still isn't doing that. He's putting Goebbels in charge of his frickin'. This is not going to be good for him. So everyone needs to stop freaking out about this stuff.
But
that they're only burying themselves. There is another election coming in 2 years, and then another one in 2 years after that.
But Jimmy, nobody wants catastrophe in the interim either. I mean, they want to see, they want to see these people have to reconcile who they are with the country, but I don't think they want to see catastrophe.
Yeah, but now they have to govern. So do you think Trump's already not going to build that wall? That one's gone. He's already not going to do a Muslim ban. That one's gone.
So also mass deportations seems to be gone.
Seems to be gone too. They're already going. My prediction is that Donald Trump will deport less Hispanics than Barack Obama did. So everybody needs to stop freaking out. If he tries to do crazy shit, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are not going to go along with it. If he does regular Republican shit, they will. So we got a regular Republican. And now but he won't even be able to get the regular Republican shit done if he kills his himself anymore with guys like Bannon. If they keep doing this stuff, he's just hampering himself to get stuff done. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Brett.
Well, no, that's all right. A couple things is the argument against Hillary's strategy was that she just kind of didn't do anything. And the sad, what I hear of yours is, yes, I totally get all your logic going together, but it also feels like not doing anything. It's let him self-destruct. But self-destruct how? He self-destructed, I mean, you compared it to Nazi Germany, but the one thing that the Nazis did so well was their media apparatus. Like, he's putting someone who's proven himself as having a great track record with establishing a media apparatus in charge of this weird, nebulous, what is his official title? Like, chief strategist in council?
Yeah.
It's like, that's the thing is that's missing, especially with Roger Ailes going down the tubes with Fox.
And the history of fascism,
good.
if you want to go there, which I don't have a problem doing, the history with fascist regimes are the first couple of years are actually pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
The people like it. The people are getting things that they wanted, and then they're kind of lulled into this sense, and then they go along willingly very often. That's what I think Trump's people have. But going back to the Clinton strategy, if you say let him be who he is, it doesn't matter now because we have no choice other than to let him be. I mean, it ended up not being a great strategy, but campaigns do spend a lot of time looking at the polls, and the inefficiency of a lot of the polling this year led them to think that was a good strategy to let this guy self-destruct because the goal was to win the presidency, right? Well, it may have been a good strategy on paper, but it didn't work out because the polls were so off. So what they were relying on to give them the information that this man was self-destructing was actually not true. So now you have the guy, right? He's there. And letting him self-destruct is great, but it's also, he's the president, or he's going to be the president. And there have to be people, you can't just stop getting all over the Steve Bannon thing because, well, this is good because it'll destruct the presidency. It'll destruct his administration. They'll never win again in 4 years. I know
someone
you're not
has to-
saying that, Jimmy, but you have to be careful because there's a fine line. You have to just hold his feet to the fire on putting this guy.
Oh no,
Yeah.
yes, I'm not. I'm saying that it's good in the sense everyone will be, their consciousness will be raised about this.
Right.
People will understand more what Trump is really about. I'm not saying ignore it. What I'm trying to tell people people are going through some shit right now.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to tell
Right.
people to calm down and that it's not going to be as bad as they think. My logic, it's not going to be as bad as they think. And the more he does things like this, it takes away his power to get stuff done. What would have made me afraid was if he staffed his place with all these really well-liked neocons, but he's staffing his place with all these people who are repulsive to everyone, which I think hurts him. If he was really got to be a Machiavellian where he was going to staff his cabinet with people who really could get some evil shit done, as opposed to guys who can't help but shoot themselves in the foot, then I would be more worried. I think this is less worrying. The more cartoonish he gets, the more power it takes away from his ability to get stuff done.